And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday Night Bible Study. We're glad that you're here. This is a broadcast, our daily broadcast from the digital campus of Newark United Pentecostal Church. We are excited that you're here. And real quick shout out to all of our first-time guests. If you're here for the first time with us, welcome. And you need to choose whether you want to interact with us via Facebook or YouTube. You can do either, but you need to choose one of those, or if you simply want to watch the broadcast, you can find that at newarkupc.info. But again, emphasis at that live tab in newarkupc.info, you cannot chat with us. So if you want to interact and ask questions, you need to go to either YouTube, and there's a link there, either YouTube or Facebook, and join us there. We are excited tonight to have our executive pastor with us, who's going to be doing the Bible study, and as always, we've got Desi, our co-host, and
hello. Good evening, Newark.
So welcome, and the lady of the night. Well, that's the wrong phrasing, isn't it?
Yeah, that is the wrong phrasing.
That's one of those times where you say something, and as it's coming out of your mouth, your brain's going,
no,
that's not what I meant.
That's not what I meant. But anyway, our guest of honor. Anyway, so Lela, I want to get out of the way and give you optimum time. To those that, if this is your first time, ready your questions, jot them down. And when it comes time for questions, we simply ask, and we'll remind you on the screen, we simply ask that you would preface your question by, in all caps if possible, question. That just helps us through all of our interaction. During COVID-19, we all like to talk to one another, but it happens in the chat feature. In fact, I've laughed with the team that when we get back to church, I'm going to yell at you all that if you talk as much in church as you have online, I'm going to get after you because you all jabber constantly. But I understand, and there's a reason, and we get it. So if you help us kind of parse through that by putting question in front of it. But I want to get out of the way. Desi and I are going to come off screen and mute ourselves. And Lela, it is all yours.
All right. Well, greetings, church family. It's good to see you all. And this live format is a little unnerving here, but hey, we're going to give it a go. We're going to continue our series tonight on personal worship. And I'm going to focus more on the aspect of worship as a lifestyle. I know we've been breaking it down in different aspects. But before I jump in, let's pray and let's ask God to be with us tonight. Jesus, Lord, we thank you, God, for this opportunity to gather in your name. God, I thank you for all these precious people who are tuning in to our service tonight. God, minister to us tonight, God, through your word. Be in our midst this night, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, to demonstrate an example of awesome, and you'll see what I mean by awesome personal worship, we're going to look at the book of Daniel. I love Daniel. And even as I went back and read this familiar story for this particular Bible study, I love him even more. Like, dude is awesome. And I think you'll agree with that when as I go through and point out some of his stellar examples of worship. So I'm going to read a lot of the first 6, actually 5. So I'm not doing 3 because I'm not going to focus on tonight, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I'm going to read a lot. You're not going to have scripture up on your screen because I don't want to distract you. You can just listen. But definitely in your own time, go back and read for yourself the details of Daniel 1 through 6. Because I want to focus in on tonight 3 things. What Daniel was facing, how he responded, and in turn, how God responded. And so I'm going to do my dead level best to kind of hone in on that. So I'm going to read chunks as I go and then stop and talk a little bit. So I'm going to start with Daniel 1. And it says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took him back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So let me just point out a few things here to sort of set us up as we go forward. One is that not only were there sacred objects taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, but there were also some of the royal family. There were people. There were folks from the royal family, those that were considered nobility. So the best of the best. And this was a common practice in the ancient world. You would take the best from countries that you would besiege and you would bring them back to your nation. And they would, in turn, you would indoctrinate them. And we'll talk about this as we go along. And they would, in turn, benefit your country. So also the objects that were taken from the temple of God, this was significant. You know, we think of countries or battles being won and they would take the loot as a reward, that kind of thing. But it wasn't just in terms of value, in terms of gold and silver and that. But this was a God thing. In fact, we take your objects that were, because remember, if you notice here that I read that they took those objects from the temple of God, of their God. And so when you take these objects, this was a way of making your God inferior to my God. So this was a big fat God battle going on. So we're gonna read a story tonight of an epic God battle. So it wasn't just the material aspect of this. I should have got my something off over here. Got sound dinging. But anyway, this wasn't just about material things. It was about whose God is bigger, whose God is greater. And so as we read, I want you to pay attention for that theme.
Hey, Leo, let me break in with you for a moment. while you fix your phone. What's really funny, folks, it's
I
not.
don't even know what that is.
No, what's funny is that you're getting blown up by members of the pastoral team and staff who are doing exactly what I was talking about, chatting in the middle of church. And that's what you're getting blown up on. So right now we're yelling at our AV tech, who will remain nameless. We will not name him. All who know who he is, who's currently sitting at the church gloating by the fact that he's watching you on the large screen in church. And he and another member of the pastoral team, who will remain nameless, are chatting about this. So anyway, go to another chat feature, people, and let the poor woman teach us.
That's right.
I'm coming off the screen again.
Thank you for rescuing me. All right. So let's pick up in our story. So as I mentioned, not only were things taken, but people were taken back to Babylon. So I'm going to pick up at verse 3 of 1. And it says, so the king, that would have been Nebuchadnezzar, told Ashpenaz, head of the palace staff, to get some Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men who are healthy and handsome and intelligent and well-educated, good prospects for leadership positions in the government, perfect specimens, and indoctrinate them in the Babylonian language and the lore of magic and fortune telling. The king then ordered that they be served from the same menu as the royal table. Best food, the finest wine. You'll notice here that I'm reading from the Message. I'm in love with the Message right now. After 3 years of training, they would be given positions in the king's court. 4 young men from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were among those selected. The head of the palace staff gave them Babylonian names. Daniel was named Belteshazzar. Hananiah was named Shadrach. Mishael was named Meshach. And Azariah was named Abednego. But Daniel determined that he would not defile himself by eating the king's food or drinking his wine. So he asked the head of the palace staff to exempt him from the royal diet. Remember, you can read on your own. I'm skipping some. But Daniel appealed to the steward who had been assigned to the head of the palace staff to be in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Try us out for 10 days on a simple diet of vegetables and water. Then compare us to the young men who eat from the royal menu. Make your decision on the basis of what you see. The steward agreed to do it and fed them vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and more robust than all the others who had been eating from the royal menu. So the steward continued to exempt them from the royal menu, food and drink serve them only vegetables. And God gave these 4 young men knowledge and skill in both books and life. In addition, Daniel was gifted in understanding all sorts of visions and dreams. At the end of the time set by the king for their training, the head of the royal staff brought them into Nebuchadnezzar. When the king interviewed them, he found them far superior to all other young men. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and skill in both books and life. And so they took their place in the king's service. Whenever the king consulted them on anything, on books or in life, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and enchanters of his kingdom put together. So let's unpack some of this that we just read. Now let's first talk about being fed from the king's table. I don't know about you, but I envision, this long, banquet table that folks will come to, whoever the king allowed to, and come and, eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner with the king. And that's not what the king's table was about. And you might want to think it more as food rations. In other words, in the case of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were more dependents of the state. So you would be supplied food. You would, not only you, but lots of other people. It could be, others, high-ranking members, administration, craftsmen, diplomats, things like that. But you would be provided food from the king. So it wasn't food as in come and meals are prepared and you come and sit and eat. So I just want to clarify that. I think that's a common misunderstanding. And the refusal of the king's meat, I know we like to think it has to do with vegetables versus meat. A lot of people think, the Daniel fast and vegetables are much better than meat and that kind. But that's not really what that issue was about. Jews were allowed to eat meat so long as it was kosher and prepared, the right way. That it wasn't a meat thing. Neither was wine necessarily the issue. Jews were allowed to drink wine, but this was really, really about Daniel wanting to preserve his identity and worship of his God. This was one way when your life is being overtaken and literally their lives literally belong to the king. This was a way of pushing back. This was a way of preserving his worship. We also noted in that chapter I just read, the whole renaming issue. And again, this was all about exercising authority over people in their destiny by renaming them. In this case, the Babylonian name, which also would have given a nod to their deity, to their God. And so Daniel was exerting his identity. I'm going to find a way in this difficult situation, in this less than ideal situation, to stay true to my God, to stay true to who I am. And if you note in verse 17 and 19, as I read, in turn, God rewarded their faithfulness. God gave those men, as he said, skill and knowledge above any others, even in Babylon. And so God rewarded that desire to stay faithful to him, even in another country. And so this week, again, I remind you that we're continuing our series on worship as a lifestyle. And here is a perfect example of being put in an unfair situation. Daniel and his friends were in Babylon, not as a result of something that they had did. The king, Jehoiakim, had made some bad decisions, obviously wasn't pleasing God, and God allowed this thing to happen. If you go back to to the beginning of Daniel, you'll see that. But they were in this situation through no fault of their own. You think about it, you find yourself in situations like that sometime. But nonetheless, they were going to maintain who they were, no matter what. So worship isn't something that you do when you're in the ideal scenario. In this case, they weren't in Jerusalem. Didn't have access to the synagogue or to other people of like faith, other than maybe the small number that were with them there in Jerusalem. And so it wasn't convenient. It wasn't about being able to, right now we're missing being in church. We want to be with people of like faith. And so my point is, they were out of their element. They could have easily just kind of settled into and assimilated into the Babylonian way, but they understood that their whole lives were dedicated to Yahweh, that they were going to worship him even in a foreign land, even amongst a foreign people. They were going to stay true. And so they did. So I'm getting down to chapter 2. And we're going to look at when Nebuchadnezzar had that dream. He had the dream about the statue. And he said he called the Babylonian magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers and fortune tellers to interpret his dream. But the fortune teller said, nobody anywhere can do what you ask. So not only did Nebuchadnezzar ask them to interpret the dream, but he threw a little monkey wrench in there, and he says, not only do I want you to interpret the dream, but I want you to tell me what the dream is in the first place. That's kind of hard, right? They couldn't do it. And so they says, nobody anywhere can do what you ask. And no king, great or small, has ever demanded anything like this from any magician, enchanter, fortune teller. What you're asking is impossible unless some god or goddess should reveal it. And they don't hang around people like us. I thought that was really funny. So they deemed it impossible. Now, the king was furious. Verses 12 and 13 says, that set the king off. He lost his temper and ordered the whole company of Babylonian wise men killed. When the death warrant was issued, Daniel and his companions were included. They were also marked for execution. When Arioch, chief of the royal guard, was making arrangements for execution, Daniel wisely took him aside and quietly asked, what's going on? Why all this all of a sudden? After Arioch filled Daniel in on the background, Daniel went to the king and asked for a little time so that he could interpret the dream. Daniel then went home and told his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what was going on. He asked them to pray to the God of heaven for mercy in solving this mystery so that the four of them wouldn't be killed along with the whole company of the Babylonian wise men. Again, we're talking about personal worship here. Imagine being in that position. He wasn't even with the wise men who came, the first time, obviously. He had to hear about it secondhand. Sound like there was a rumor mill going on, which is why he pulled Arioch to the side and asked him what's going on. But nonetheless, he was going to be executed like the rest of them. So note Daniel's response. Now I'm talking, he's in a foreign land amongst foreign people. And the scripture said he wisely took him aside quiet and asked what was going on. You know, I can imagine some of us losing our minds. Sometimes when we're outside of our element or when we're faced, with scary circumstances, we just want to go off. You know, what's happening here? Just, acting all crazy. And maybe I won't say that. But no, he kept his cool and he asked him what's going on. And then he went home and he consulted with his boys, I'll say, and he said, let's ask God of heaven to solve this mystery. It's a form of worship. We talk about prayer as worship. This is what we do. Why would we do anything else, right? We belong to him. So let's ask God to help us. And again, he didn't lose his mind. He didn't conspire with Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah to plan some kind of revolt or do something radical. Let's continue to do what we always do, which is worship. In this case, we're going to worship by calling on God for help. That night, the answer to the mystery was given to Daniel in a vision. God showed up. And so let's drop down. So he comes back before the king. I'm getting ahead of myself over here. And Daniel answered the king. He goes in before the king to tell him he has the interpretation of the dream. And he says to the king, no mere man can solve the king's mystery. I don't care who it is. No wise man, no enchanter, no magician, no diviner. But there is a God in heaven who solves mysteries. And he has solved this one. He is letting King Nebuchadnezzar know what's going to happen in the days ahead. Note here that Daniel made sure to give God the glory. Not, oh, look at me, I'm so great. I have the interpretation of the dream for you. No, let me tell you who exactly gave me the interpretation of the dream. God did. So he made sure he gave God credit, and then he proceeded to interpret the dream about the huge statue for the king. Here's Nebuchadnezzar's response. When Daniel finished, King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face in awe before Daniel. He ordered the offering of sacrifices and burning of incense in Daniel's honor. And he said to Daniel, your God is beyond question, the God of all gods, the master of all kings. He solves all mysteries. I know because he solved this one. It was not lost on Nebuchadnezzar how huge this was. He knew that bunch of, I'm envisioning them as kind of ragtag enchanters and advisors, weren't, I think he knew they weren't legit. But when he made this statement, your God is beyond question. He's the God of all God. That was huge. In the ancient world, this God thing was big. My God is bigger than your God. But your God is beyond all gods. So Nebuchadnezzar was giving big props to God. And so what was the outcome ultimately? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted and God was glorified. So I'm talking about when your life is submitted to God and when you maintain who you are in all circumstances, then you unleash God to do work in your life, to work beyond what you could even imagine. And so here we see the outcome of that. All right, I'm skipping down to chapter 4. Where now Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And this is a dream about the tree. And so he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. But that night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. So I issued an order calling in the wise men of Babylon so that they could tell me what my dream meant. When all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers came in, I told them the dream, but they could not tell me what it meant. At last, Daniel came in before me, and I told him the dream. Okay, so he's telling Daniel his dream again. So Daniel interprets his dream. And then upon hearing this, I'm dropping way down the story. Daniel was afraid to tell the king what the dream meant because it wasn't good news for Nebuchadnezzar. So verse 19 says, upon hearing this, Daniel was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream. Then the king said to him, Belteshazzar, don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means. And Belteshazzar replied, I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my lord, and not to you. That's wow. I meant to tell you at the outset, I'm probably going to say wow quite a few times in this Bible study because some of this just kind of blew me away. What a response. Remember, Daniel's probably been in Babylon for quite some time now, but he's not Babylonian and he's not there of his own volition. And he doesn't have his freedom to come and go. I mean, maybe within the confines of Babylon, but he can't just up and pack his bag. He's still a captive, if you will. And his response to the king is not only with respect, but even with affection. I wish it would happen to your enemies. And even if you pay attention to how the king spoke to Daniel, there's a relationship that's been built here, clearly between the king and Daniel. And so, again, in the sense of talking about worship as a lifestyle, Daniel is demonstrating compassion, kindness. He it's not his king per se, but I still care about what happens to him. Somehow he's demonstrating compassion. It makes me think of the scripture that said that we should love our enemies and do good to those who despitefully use us. Here's an example of that. He's in a strange land. If you remember by what means he got there, I was taken to this land, but yet I'm wishing good somehow for the king. And so that's a pretty big statement to me that Daniel would speak to him in that manner. Okay, so Daniel interprets the dream, and we all know the outcome of that. Again, God was given glory. He was elevated, and all was well for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right, so let's drop down. So time has passed. Now Nebuchadnezzar has died, and a new king is in power, King Belshazzar. And chapter 5 says, many years later, King Belshazzar gave a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver cups that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. While they drank from them, they praised their idols, made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and stone. And remember, I told you that this whole, taking of things from the temple of the god, this was a whose God is bigger than the other God. So this was extremely disrespectful. So while you are drinking from the vessels that were dedicated to the God of the Israelites, while you're doing that, you're praising your gods. And so they were saying, now you're inferior to us. And so suddenly they saw a finger, a human hand writing on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. The king himself saw the hand as he wrote, and his face turned pale with fright. His knees knocked together in fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. But here we go again. But when all the kings and wise men had come in, none of them could read the writing or tell them what it meant. So the king grew even more alarmed, and his face turned pale. His nobles, too, were shaken. But when the queen mother heard what was happening, she hurried to the banquet hall. She said to Belshazzar, "Long live the king. Don't be so pale and frightened. There's a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods." So they sent for Daniel. In Daniel comes again, and he's brought in before the king. And the king says to Daniel, "If you can read these words, tell me their meaning. You will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor, and you will have gold chains placed around your neck, and you will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." This is big stuff here. So note Daniel's response. Daniel says to the king, "Keep your gifts and give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means." And he goes on to tell King Belshazzar what the meaning of the writing is. So first, before he did that, he reminded the king of his predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar's. He reminded him of his arrogance. He reminded him of where that led him, how that caused him to have to go around on all fours, and he just recapped it all for him. And he reminded him of Nebuchadnezzar's restoration when he humbled himself. And then he says in verse 22, you are his successor, O Belshazzar, and you knew all this. Yet you have not humbled yourself, for you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven, and have these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles and your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Gods that neither see nor hear, nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you breath, the breath of life, and controls your destiny. So he has sent this hand to write this message. Okay, so he goes on. I'm trying to stay focused here on the topic at hand here, not get too down in the weeds. But again, what was the outcome? Daniel was honored and proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And God's enemy, in this case, Belshazzar, was killed that very night. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it's not good to do what he did. And my point here is God showed up, right? So Daniel was faithful. God shows up. So Daniel served through at least 3 administrations in Babylon, which is also pretty big. So I'm going to skip down to the last chapter, which is chapter 6 really quick. And we'll read one more story and take note of what happened. So now we have a new king. Now King Darius, the Mede, is on the throne. And the king chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and to protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. It's crazy. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connecting him with his religion. Worship as a lifestyle. Daniel had so effectively served his God in less than ideal circumstances that his enemies could find no fault. In other words, in fact, it became the thing that they could conspire to use against him. We know that he's so faithful to his God that maybe that's the one area that we can try to trip him up on. So not only has Daniel's reputation preceded him with the king, but also with his haters, I call them. They were jealous of Daniel. None could top him. And so it's interesting that what his haters said about him, that he's always responsible, that he's faithful, and he's completely trustworthy. I know we struggle with issues on our job. We don't like our boss. We don't like different scenarios. There's all kind of things that we don't like in life that we face. And sometimes we're not always faithful because of those things we like. But again, here's an example of a man whose life is not his own, if you will. He's at the behest of the king, and yet he's faithful in serving these pagan kings. But to the point where they crosses God, and we'll see what I mean by that. So Daniel was faithful. Here's an example. Matthew 10 is popping to my mind when it says, blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness. In other words, the message puts it this way: you're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. This is a perfect example of that. Okay, so let's drop down a little bit. Let's see what happened really quick. I'm running out of time here. So it says, so the administrators and high officers went to the king and they said, long live the king. And they basically talked the king into, making a law that, on a certain period of time, nobody could worship any other God, either divine or human. And the king signs off, this is a great idea. But what did Daniel do? Verse 10 says, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and he knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. And I'm stopping there. My life belongs to Yahweh in his case. I'm going to serve him no matter what. That decree didn't phase him one iota. He went about worshiping his God as he always did. Verse 13, when it came to the king's attention, the king was troubled. He didn't want Daniel to get in trouble. And so, in fact, the king tried to find a way to get him out of it. Okay, so, but having to keep his word, the king's word is everything. He had to concede to their demands, and he said to Daniel, verse 16, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. That sounds like a prayer. Like the king is wishing the best for Daniel in return. And that night, it said the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. That's kind of deep there. I hadn't noticed that before, that he spent the night fast. He wouldn't eat. He refused his own. Maybe he was praying to Daniel's God. I don't know. They didn't care about multiple gods the way we do. But anyway, my point is to draw your attention to how this affected the king. Very early the next morning, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. And when he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God whom you serve so faithfully able to rescue you from the lions? Note Daniel's response. Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. Here's another wow, I promise you was coming. I'm wrapping up, Steve. Okay, so not only was he able to stay faithful to God and to worship consistently, but in doing so, it didn't mean he had to wrong the king. Right? I can serve you, king, and stay faithful to my God. But when you ask me to do something that crosses my God, now we have another story, like deny me, the ability to worship him. And so Daniel was able to do both. The king was overjoyed and ordered Daniel to be lifted from the lion's den. Not a scratch was found on him, and as he had trusted in God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor. Now, mind you, that was the king's doing. That wasn't Daniel's doing. I want to focus on Daniel and his right responses in this whole scenario. Daniel didn't wish his enemies dead. He wasn't, he wasn't wanting vengeance, but this is what happened. So, the scripture said that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Even in all this, Daniel, nowhere in the scriptures does it say that he was wishing harm on any of the kings. This was the third one that he had served under so far, nor even his enemies. He was intent on doing his best, worshiping his God. All right, so we know the outcome of that is what happened again. Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. You couldn't stop him because he was faithful to his God. So as you guys are populating questions, I know you are already here. I'm just thinking of some of the thoughts that come with this. That when we understand that our whole lives belong to God, everything about us belongs to God, then we understand that there's no scenario that it's okay for us not to obey him, even in situations like this that are less than ideal. That everything we do, we live and breathe and have our being in him. So we're always Christians. Not, again, in ideal situations, but we're always his, no matter where we are, no matter what scenario. And that when we humble ourselves and when we honor God and we do the things that God has called us to do as Christians, then we release God's power to work in ways that we could never work. And so in this case, I mean, you can think about in Peter where he says, honor the government, show respect. I mean, the king and that was government. They were the ones running things. And so again, as we continue here in this vein of personal worship and worship as a lifestyle, you have more power with God in staying true to him. You have greater ability to affect your world and the things going on by submitting to him and staying faithful to the things of God than you do taking things into your own hand. I'll leave you with one last verse that from Zechariah 4:6, when God said to Zerubbabel, "It's not by force nor by strength, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord." We are people of God, and we're not going to accomplish things by carnal measures. And so we have to remember that we need to turn to God for help and not rely on our own resources, our own methods of doing things. That when we submit ourselves to Him, then we unleash His power. All right, I'm gonna shut up because I'll keep going and it won't be in time for questions. All right.
All right. Well, you may be able to see, Lela, on your screen that Desi and I are on screen just down in the corner.
Yes.
And so at this point, I think they innovated on our technology a little bit, Desi. That was not an option last week when we did this, so this is better.
Well, I know this is a new platform, so they're still working on it. Although
I do. The only challenge is while we're doing questions, when I display the question, then it only displays in one of the three. So I'm going to leave us down in the bottom. If we don't have any questions, I can take it off Spotlight and we can become the three amigos. Though I did see today some texting happening on our Facebook page. I don't know. Desi's kind of agnostic about Facebook, but on Facebook, Joyce posted something about what gift describes your pastor best, and somebody posted the Three Stooges. I don't know how to reflect that. I'm not sure who are the three because there's
not share that with me.
Yeah, there's 9 of us on the pastoral team. So I'm wondering, is it like all of us are the Three Stooges? I did like another post that was even better, and then we'll get to questions. Which was I was told by my kids it was not Marvel, it was DC, but the whole action figure team that looks pretty good. Yeah, that one felt pretty good. Brother Joe and Sister Julie posted. I'm sure it had only to do with me, but had a super dog, with his arm raised in the air, soaring through it, and so that's probably me. Little dog with lots of bark, but anyway. But I don't know, those Three Stooges, Arash and Desi and I maybe were the 3 candidates from last week, that profile of 3 of us. So I don't know. We'll see. But let's turn this over to Desi and see if we can get back to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and specifically looking at worship as a lifestyle.
All right. So to everyone, just a reminder, now is the time if you've got questions or things you'd like us to discuss with Daniel. As I'm looking through it, so far, I only see 2 questions posted. I will pass those along to Lela, but
all right.
We've got plenty of time, so go ahead and submit your questions. Lela, we'll start with a question from one of our young people that asked, where do you think Daniel was in the story of the 3 Hebrew boys when they had to bow to the king's image and then were cast into the fire? Daniel's absent from that story.
He is absent from that story, and it's right in the middle of these 6. That story is right in the middle of these 6 chapters that I just read you, and I skipped over tonight. Hey, I don't know. Is that a leave enough answer? He's somewhere around the kingdom. I do think that Daniel was a leader, so it seemed, in the kingdom. I think Daniel was probably very instrumental in, this is me thinking, but I'm just picking up from, in the very beginning when Daniel pushed back about the food, and you see Daniel being the one speaking, initiating. And so I think that Daniel showed some leadership amongst the Hebrews who were in Babylon at that time. And perhaps he helped strengthen them to stay faithful. This is me speculating, but I don't know where he was in particular, but he was around because his story encapsulates theirs in that
right.
Those 6 chapters. Beyond that, I don't know, babies.
Fair enough. The safest biblical answer is that we don't know. He's absent from the story. Yeah. If you want a different perspective, Steve, I believe you did a series on Daniel some years ago. This predates, my work at this church, but correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't you do a series on Daniel?
I did a series on Daniel. Currently,
and you proposed a different.
I did. I proposed an alternative theory. You can probably find it if you do an old webcast and podcast search. It's probably out there. One thing, our executive assistant's really good at sleuthing those things out. You might reach out to Joyce call the church office, and because currently it's not up. It was on our old website. We need to get it up because I like the series. But in 30 seconds, the theory is that Daniel was actually there. And the idea is that Daniel, in that he had ascended, he had become prominent, and he felt the pressure to simply stand by. He was on the dais, which meant that he would not necessarily have been bowing. All of the people were being called to it, but he had risen to such prominence. He was on the dais with the king, and so he stood by. He held silent. And the theory, and it is very much what Desi already said. It's very much a theory. You cannot prove it. The theory is because Daniel is so absent in the story at that point. Why is he so absent? And that's the starting question. Why is he not present? The rest of the entire book, he's present in every piece of it. And so the starting question is it possible that he was there? And the reason he's so silent is because he, in fact, didn't do the right thing. His 3 boys that had hung with him did the right thing, and he did not. Now, if that theory is correct, here closes out the story, that puts a whole nother context to his response under Darius. Because now
with the lion's den in Daniel chapter 6.
Because the scripture says that Daniel intentionally opened his windows. He could have left his windows closed and still prayed. But why did he intentionally open his windows, insisting that they see him? And the theory behind it is he was in fact redeeming himself from a previous mistake of pressure. And it actually, for me, adds something to it, because we make mistakes in our worship. We feel pressures from society around us and from our jobs and from our family. And but again, the safest biblical, ironclad, firm answer is we don't know where Daniel is. That was a little bit of conjecture, exegetical conjecture on my part. You can hate me or love me for it, but that was my thoughts.
And we didn't want to, and it takes a while to unpack it. That's why I referenced that previous series, if people can find that podcast, because
I think I did 3 or 4 sermons on it. That I
multiple lessons unpacking that.
Right. It also seems pretty inconsistent, though, that he would bow. Now I know we're just jumping off on somewhat a rabbit trail here, but it's not consistent with anything that we do see that he actually did or that he refrained from in those chapters. But
it is.
Yeah.
That's part of what attracts me, because I've been working a lot of years, and we humans are highly inconsistent. So and part of the premise, as Desi turns to the next question, part of the premise is we many times we lift these biblical characters up as if they're better than us, and they're not. They are broken just like us. They are tempted just like us. They have struggles just like us. And so many times we lift them up so high that we can't ever reach them. And so that was the drive of having people recognize the humanity. Des, you got another question?
I do. So I'm going to take another question, and it's a bit lengthy, so I'm going to see if I can reword it and summarize it a little bit.
Okay.
And it says, in the diverse world that we live in, why do you think it is so hard for us to keep our worship and teaching and our beliefs out in our workplace? Do you think that we still fear now, perhaps more than ever, that we might offend someone with what we say or how we act, and perhaps jeopardize our employment or those around us? We see Daniel in these very adverse circumstances. So what do we do? Yeah. How do you think that affects us now? Can you help us tie it to the present day?
Sure. One thing I think about is that, and I'm not sure whether this is a North American thing. I've only been here, but I know we have this mentality that we segment things. In other words, when we go to church, we behave one way. We did that whole series not too long ago on culture versus Bible. It's when we go to church that we dress a certain way, we behave a certain way. There's this whole culture within church.
Yeah.
And then when you go here, you do this, and you go here to do that. And that's really the impetus behind this whole series we're talking about, that if worship is your life, if you serve God always, you've heard people say, well, I'm in church, I'm not going to say that. Or, there's all these little goofy things we say because we're in church. And that's indicative of a mentality. Is our God confined to a church building? But if he is, we're in trouble. Because right now, we ain't in it. You know? And if God is confined, then how are you conducting yourself in your home? And so it's definitely a mentality. You know, I've heard people say, you know, they wear certain things at church because they're going to honor God. Don't you honor God always? So anyway, my point is that's the whole point of this series, is to kind of deal with that mentality that if our whole lives belong to God, then we worship him wherever we are, in every way, on the workplace. I mean, you know, I was a manager at Christiana for years, and I had lots of Christians that worked for me. And you know, there's just this thing about what's okay to do. In this case, just using Daniel as an example. I mean, he was a situation where, you know, he was working, you can say, for this pagan king.
Right.
You know, but he didn't disrespect the man. He didn't cheat him. He didn't, you know, them anyway. You know, he didn't do wrong because this man was ungodly. And I have experience in my work experience that, you know, when people don't like what the boss does, or when they don't like what the company does, it gives them license somehow to step out of their Christianity, if you will, and behave in ways that are not pleasing to God. And it shouldn't be. So I don't know where the mentality started from. Scott, I think I saw that was you. But I know that it's prevalent. And so really that's what we're dealing with. We need to worship God in every scenario, whether
a consistency to our lifestyle, whether we're in church or at work or at home.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah. You know, we had the little funny saying, I don't know who started years ago, was the WWJD, what would Jesus do? You know, really, when you're faced with things, you have to always remember to whom you belong first and foremost. We're Christians. Mm-hmm. You know, and what would God have me do in this scenario? Right. Now about you know, I don't want to be flailing, you know, being ineffective in these situations. How many times have you taken situations in your own hands and they just came out horrible? You know, but if you give them to God, if you conduct yourself in a way that's pleasing to him, just taking Daniel as an example, God shows up. And at the very least, you haven't brought dishonor to God. Because sometimes our behavior in taking things in our own hands actually dishonor our God.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for answering that. We'll go on to another one, and you've still got time. If anybody wants to submit any other questions, you're welcome to do that either through YouTube or Facebook. As you submit those questions, it's fed through a separate stream to Stephen and I, and then we will share them with Lela. Here's a question coming from Ruth Lanciano. It's an excellent question. She asks, how do we discern between civil disobedience, as when Daniel prayed with his window open, and when to obey the law, as in how Daniel allowed his name to be changed? So we see in Daniel times when Daniel did work with the laws of the land, and yet we also see very clearly in Daniel 6 a time where he practiced, this is a modern term, but it's a fair way to describe it, this idea of civil disobedience.
Yeah, I think there's the term, you know, pick your battles might come in handy here. You know, right? You can clearly illustrated in this text that Daniel was solid about who he was, right? You know that. You know, I forgot. I had what his name meant, and it just went out of my head right now.
God is my judge.
God is my judge. Thank you, Desi. Whose real name is Daniel. Now that I just remember it. Sorry, I put you on blast, Desi. But yeah, God is my judge. Like Daniel had it clear who he was. You know, again, maybe the name thing didn't mean much to him. You know, you see, and even in the text, you see that their Babylonian names and their Hebrew names were kind of used interchangeably in the text. But what comes to mind here is picking your battles. You when it came time to crossing his God, like refusing or not allowing him to worship, you saw that Daniel stood his ground. No, I'm drawing a line, not doing that. Or should I say, I'm going to continue to do that. So there's so many things that we're bombarded with that you know we could be flailing at all kind of things. Again, I'm talking about injustices, things that come up that when it doesn't infringe on your faith, that's how I put it. I mean, when you tell me I can't honor my God, when you tell me I can't, that now you're crossing a line. Some of the other things may be less significant. That's kind of my general take on it, but.
And it could be, and that's what we see in the story, if I can jump in. In Daniel 1, you rightly pointed out the issue was not meat versus vegetables. The issue was food that had been sacrificed to idols.
Correct.
And he's saying, no, this crosses a line in my relationship with God that I cannot cross.
Right.
And Desi, if I could jump in too, I've been monitoring the chat also, and this question intersects very nicely with Scott's earlier question. That part of it is paying attention to the context in which we live as well, and discerning between. Now, this is going to sound, you're going to think I'm wishy-washy in what I'm answering you here. Okay, Christian, listen to me though. It's discerning the context in which you live and how that intersects with the commands and laws of God. We Americans have trouble having our rights in any way impinged on. We're used to going around and doing whatever we bloom and want to do.
Commanding our rights.
Absolutely. Right. We are an agitated people. I'm just going to say we are an arrogant people. I've traveled internationally enough that we are, and I myself am arrogant, so I'm not throwing any stones, okay? I'm not saying I should be, but I'm saying that I am. I think that the world should move and get a move on it when I flash my American passport, okay? So part of that, we live that way within North America, okay? We even act that way, forgive us, our northern good neighbors. We even act that way towards our Canadian brothers and sisters. We act arrogant, okay? That intersects with what we consider being obedient to God. See, the Bible paints a totally different picture. It paints a picture of a witness that we would consider silent, but the Bible considers very loud. And it's what this week is about, which is a witness that is based not in what we say, but in how we live.
That's right.
That's exactly right. And so sometimes I think we struggle with, because we live in a society, North America and the United States in particular, is not a Christian nation. And now I'll get lots of hate mail out of this. Okay, I don't care.
So let me finesse your answer. We can say, and this we can argue definitively, that at this point America is a post-Christian nation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the context. I'm not even arguing whether we were once a Christian nation. That's not the point. The point is we are not currently a Christian nation. The tenets of our forefathers was that anyone could live here with freedom of religion. So that means that my rights have limits. And the limits are Lela's rights. Anytime my rights impinge on Lela's rights or Lela's rights impinge on my rights, we have to create a buffer zone. And so a lot of times we get very confused by thinking, because in order to show respect to one another in that environment, we don't get to be blatantly or militantly Christian. You're missing the point of worship as witness. You're missing the point of lifestyle as worship. Because how you treat your employees is worship. How you conduct yourself in the midst of crisis is
how
worship.
You respond to your employer. Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely.
How you deal with a person who doesn't believe like you do and maybe even comes after you is in fact itself witness.
And you have to, and there has to be a balance. I'm going to step on, if you're doing it, I'm going to step on toes a little bit. Something to think about in a secular work environment. And I've been bivocational my entire ministry up until last year. So I'm not unfamiliar with this. I'm intimately familiar with this. And I've worked for small little places, and I've worked for large Fortune 100 companies and massive corporate environments. Part of that freedom of religion is also learning to respect the rights of other religions. And so as Christians, we need to learn to be respectful in our interactions with those who are not of the Christian faith. And sometimes it requires us to take a breath and pause and step back and think. If I want the right for a Christian chaplain to be able to open with prayer on the Senate floor, then I can't be too upset when a Muslim imam does the same thing, or a Hindu priest. And I know I'm going to make people angry by saying that. But if I have the rights to express prayer and to worship, and I'm grateful for those rights, that means other people have those rights as well.
Correct.
And I can respectfully disagree and
Mhm.
yet still be a Christian in my interaction. Being a Christian doesn't mean that I have to stomp around and be angry with everybody else because they don't do it the way that I do it.
Yeah.
And I think Daniel is an awesome example because he lives in a totally pagan environment.
Right.
And he draws the lines. We see Paul do the same thing when he's in Athens, and he draws the line. So I think we're the ones with the problems, and that's why I started, Desi and Lela, with the example of us Americans. We have an arrogance problem that really our Christianity calls us to humble ourselves. All right. Take it away, Desi, before we make too many people angry, and give us another question.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, depending on how fast she answers this. So, if you had to narrow down, all right, here's a question from Meg. If you had to narrow down the reasons why Daniel was so consistent with his faith and worship in the midst of a crisis, what would you say those reasons are? Why do you feel, and I agree, that Daniel's set up as this example for us? What do you think are the reasons that he was able to be so consistent?
Well, again, I can only speculate. But one, I thought about, and I'm not sure how this plays in, to be honest, but I thought about at the beginning of the story, it talked about how they took those from the royal family and those of nobility. And I wonder if, when I did a little research in Daniel, I didn't find where Daniel came from. Obviously, he was from one of those families. Perhaps royalty understands royalty, and the authority and how it works. Perhaps it could have been some of that in terms of, okay, I'm totally out of control here. Me as a man, meaning, as a mere man, I'm not going to prevail. You know what I mean? In fact, I'm at the king's mercy. The king, the king is everything, especially in those times. I'm at his mercy. So, in my flesh, I'm not going to win. But I think that the consistency factor more than likely happened before Daniel ever hit Babylon. That he was a worshiper always, anyway. And sometimes when you're in dire situation, I'm throwing in multiple things. My brain is rolling here. What choice did Daniel have? In other words, there's no distractions. I'm here. In the king's service, and it's the best I can do. Is to maybe, if he wasn't so faithful before, we don't know. And I'm going to lean into this thing because I need God more than ever. You think about how in your life, sometimes we're wishy-washy in our walk, but when we hit a crisis, we get dedicated. You know what I mean? It sobers us up. I don't know. We don't have much of the pre-story about Daniel, but maybe some of that. Some of you are in Christ right now because you hit a huge crisis in life, when life became out of control, and it became abundantly clear that you needed God to get you out of that scenario or get you through that scenario. So perhaps it's some of that.
Thank you. All right, we're coming to the top of the hour, and I appreciate all of you who have been posting, and I thank you for the questions. We've got one more question, and we're going to end on a high note. Ooh. Most important question. You ready for this? I didn't throw at you a lightning round like we did Arash last week, so keep it in mind. Here we go. So closing out tonight.
You can't do that because there are children, Desi, that are scarred now that the unicorns were eaten by the
dinosaurs.
T-Rex.
Yeah, no. By the dinosaurs. The T-Rex died of a virus, but
that's right.
Yes, by dinosaurs.
COVID.
We're gonna have to rush back some other time in the future for another lightning round. Maybe we could take like 20 minutes and just have people populate. But that's not where we're going tonight. Tonight, final question of the night. You brace for this, Lela? Are you ready?
Oh boy, here we go.
All right. Daniel chapter 6, story of Daniel and the lions. What kind of lions were they? Were they African lions, Savannah lions, or Lion King lions?
They were definitely not Lion King lions. Which actually they were African lions, so that's a catch-22. So you asked the same question. African lions and African lions. I don't know. I always envision them, male lions are the ones with the big mane, right? I always envision the big, those things are, they give you the chill. So anyway.
Should you tell her,
That
Desi,
name
you
is
asked the
intimidating, but I'll tell you, if I came across a female lion out in the wilderness, like I wouldn't want to tangle with her either.
I don't know. I don't want to be funny.
Yeah.
Wait, are you being funny? What was the catch
Oh,
of that?
I think you should tell her who asked the question.
Caleb would like to.
Caleb Beers.
So I'm not sure it was a serious question.
It could have been. Thank you, Caleb.
All right. Well, folks, that brings us to the close of the hour.
All right.
We're glad that you're able to be here. Let me remind you, if you have not joined us in small groups, you need to. In this season that we're in, this is the key. And you can do that by going to newyorkupc.info. You can also partner with us in giving there through our digital giving. You also can submit prayer requests, which we take very seriously, and pray with you. Any needs that you have. You can find previous broadcasts, links to all of that. Our media archive is there. So lots of good stuff at newyorkupc.info. To our church family, over the next several weeks, if you happen to have gone to newyorkupc.org, you may have first found nothing. Then you found nothing but a holder page. But be looking for that will become our front-facing website. And that's getting worked on. So be patient with us as we work on that and get things going there. But to all the rest of you and to everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. And we're going to have a great week coming up. We're celebrating Pentecost on Sunday, but it'll start on Saturday night. Got a great broadcast Saturday night. And you don't want to miss this Friday night with friends. We get to have a distinguished guest, Brother Bruce Howell, who is the Global Missions Director. So all of the missions efforts of the United Pentecostal Church, he leads those efforts. He's going to be with us at 7 o'clock on Friday night. You don't want to miss that. And then we're going to celebrate Pentecost across all of next week. So we're going to have a great time together. Be safe, everyone. We love you. And as I like to say,
good night.
Good night.
Good night.